When a world goes quiet and the sky fills with distant stars, strange stories begin to surface. Accounts of missing hours, silent lights, and ordinary people waking up with no memory of how the night ended. Across deserts, highways, forests, and city apartments, witnesses describe the same patterns: sudden brightness, frozen bodies, broken signals, and time that slips away without warning. Authorities dismiss them. Media ignores them. Records fade. Yet the details remain consistent, passed from one voice to another. These are not famous cases, not headline stories, but hidden encounters that refuse to disappear, waiting in the darkness for someone to finally look closer. As night falls and the stars twinkle quietly overhead, many of us find ourselves drifting into sleep, sometimes with the feeling that something greater than ourselves is out there, watching. Maybe we've heard whispers of strange phenomena, tales of encounters with beings from another world, or odd sightings in the night sky. The phenomenon of alien abductions is one that has captured the collective imagination for decades, blurring the lines between reality and fiction, belief and skepticism. But what happens when the stories we hear are not the ones covered by mainstream news? When the abductions remain shrouded in mystery, and the witnesses, in many cases, are left to grapple with experiences that no one believes? Alien abduction stories have long been intertwined with the annals of modern folklore. Since the 1960s, when the Betty and Barney Hill abduction case first thrust this subject into public attention, the idea that extraterrestrial beings might be interacting with humanity in ways we cannot comprehend has both fascinated and terrified people around the world. Yet, despite the growing body of experiences shared by those who claim to have been abducted, there are still many who dismiss these encounters as nothing more than hallucinations, sleep paralysis, or fabrications. But what if the truth is more complex? What if the stories that remain hidden, the ones that didn't make the headlines, are far more chilling than we could have ever imagined? What if the media, with its limited scope and often dismissive attitude toward such phenomena, is overlooking an entire category of alien abductions that might have once been part of an even darker narrative? The very nature of alien abductions, the way they're often sensationalized and twisted by popular culture, obscures the reality behind them, leaving us with only fragments of truth. The world of UFOs and extraterrestrial encounters is filled with contradictions and mysteries that are as unsettling as they are intriguing. On the one hand, countless individuals claim to have experienced strange, unexplainable events, flashes of light in the sky, encounters with beings they could barely describe, or the sense of being taken against their will for unknown purposes. On the other hand, those same individuals often face ridicule and disbelief from the wider world. While some abduction stories have become famous over time, with testimonies preserved in books, documentaries, and even Hollywood movies, many others remain obscure, fading into the background of UFO lore. These stories are not sensationalized, often without any clear explanation for what occurred. And perhaps most troubling, there are few answers, leaving only questions in their wake. The idea of alien abduction has a deep psychological impact on those who experience it. It is not merely about being taken. It is about the erosion of one's sense of reality, of control. Imagine for a moment being a witness to something so beyond comprehension, something that disrupts every facet of your understanding of the world. This is not just an encounter with something unknown. It's a confrontation with the very limits of human experience. The trauma is often profound, leaving witnesses with a mix of fear, confusion, and a sense of profound isolation. They know what they saw, what they felt. But how do you explain that to others when they can't even begin to fathom what you're describing? In fact, many people who claim to have been abducted experience a form of dissociation, where their memories become fragmented or altered over time. They might recall pieces of the event, like flashes of lights, figures standing by their bed, or strange sensations of being moved without their consent. But the full picture often eludes them. The missing time phenomenon is common among abduction reports, where hours seem to disappear from memory, leaving behind only an eerie emptiness. While mainstream science often dismisses these phenomena as psychological conditions, ranging from sleep paralysis to the influence of pop culture. There are others who argue that what these individuals are experiencing might be real, but simply beyond our current understanding. The skepticism that surrounds alien abduction stories often stems from a lack of tangible proof, no physical evidence, no clear footage, and often no consistent recollection of the event itself. But could that be exactly what makes these encounters so chilling? That the evidence is elusive, hidden, or even erased. In many of the most compelling cases, the witnesses have remained steadfast in their accounts, even in the face of ridicule and doubt. They describe beings, often humanoid in appearance, but with a disturbing, otherworldly quality. Some report being subjected to medical procedures, others describe interactions with beings that seem to communicate telepathically, and a few even recount what could be described as a feeling of paralysis, where they are unable to move, speak, or defend themselves. For these individuals, the experience is not merely a nightmare. It is a deeply disturbing event that feels as though it crosses the boundary between the real and the unreal. One of the most unsettling aspects of these abduction stories is the role that fear plays in shaping the memories. Fear, particularly fear of the unknown, has a profound psychological impact on human memory. In these cases, fear can sometimes cloud the line between reality and imagination. In the absence of concrete evidence, the witness is left with only their memories, which can be distorted, fragmented, or even reshaped by the mind as it tries to make sense of what happened. The question then becomes, is it possible that these individuals are not fabricating their experiences, but are instead experiencing something that defies our understanding of reality? The cultural significance of alien abduction stories is also undeniable. While early encounters were often dismissed as hoaxes or the result of psychological trauma, over the years, these stories have become a staple of popular culture. From a 1977 classic Close Encounters of the Third Kind to the more recent TV series like The X-Files, UFOs and abductions have become part of the collective imagination. This cultural influence has only intensified with the rise of online communities, where people can freely share their experiences and find others who have gone through similar events. This sense of connection, of belonging, provides a measure of comfort for those who feel alienated by their experiences, but it also amplifies the mystery. With each new story shared, the fabric of this strange, hidden world grows thicker and more complex. However, there is still a pervasive skepticism in both the public and scientific realms. The media, particularly the more mainstream outlets, often take a dismissive approach to alien abduction stories, focusing instead on the sensational aspects, extraterrestrials as threatening invaders or shadowy figures lurking in the dark. This coverage, or lack thereof, has a significant impact on public perception. For the majority of people, alien abduction is something they only encounter in science fiction movies or conspiracy theories. They rarely consider the possibility that something might be happening beyond their understanding. Yet, there are countless reports from ordinary people around the world who describe chilling, detailed accounts of encounters with beings from other worlds. These individuals come from different walks of life: farmers, teachers, doctors, and even police officers. Yet their stories often share similarities, as though they're drawn from the same script. In some cases, multiple witnesses have corroborated each other's accounts, each person describing the same events from their own perspective. And while these stories may not make the headlines, they have become an integral part of the ongoing discussion about the unexplained. As we begin to examine these lesser-known abduction cases, we must approach them not with skepticism, but with an open mind, acknowledging the deep mystery they present. What if these stories are not just fantastical fabrications, but part of a larger, unexplained phenomenon that lies just beyond the edges of our understanding? What if, in the quiet of the night, when the stars shine the brightest, something far more extraordinary is happening, something we are not yet equipped to comprehend? These questions, and the mysteries they raise, are exactly what we will explore. The stories you are about to hear are not the ones that make the front page, nor are they the ones we've grown familiar with. These are the cases that remain shrouded in mystery, the ones that have never been fully explained or understood. As we delve into each of these chilling encounters, we will explore the depths of human experience, the edges of our understanding, and the possibility that we are not alone in the universe. The answers may not come easily, but the journey will leave you pondering the questions long after the last story is told. And as the night deepens and sleep begins to take hold, remember this: the unknown is always closer than we think. The night was calm in the small town of Las Cruces, New Mexico, a place where the desert stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars, far away from the hustle and bustle of city life. Yet, on a quiet evening in 1979, a strange event would disrupt this peaceful landscape forever. The Gallegos family, a humble couple with 2 young children, had just settled in for the night. Little did they know, their lives were about to take an inexplicable turn that would leave not only their family, but also the entire town in a state of confusion and fear. It started innocently enough: a series of bright lights in the sky, flickering in a way that no airplane or helicopter could account for. At first, the lights seemed distant, almost like a natural phenomenon, something the family could easily dismiss. But as the hours passed, the lights grew nearer, more erratic, and their intensity increased. The family, initially skeptical, became more and more unsettled as the phenomenon grew closer and began to take on an almost otherworldly form. Around midnight, the Gallegos family was suddenly awakened by a blinding light that filled their entire home. The children, startled and confused, ran to their parents' bedroom, where they all huddled together in fear. For hours, they reported seeing strange, glowing orbs that hovered just outside their windows, casting long shadows across the room. They described hearing a low, humming sound, like the vibrations of a distant engine, but no source could be seen. They attempted to look outside, but the intensity of the light prevented them from discerning anything clearly. The family members grew increasingly frightened but stayed indoors, hoping the lights would eventually disappear. Instead, the lights remained, moving in unusual patterns across the sky. The family remained inside, trying to comfort each other, but something was different this time. The air felt thick with a strange energy, and the eerie hum seemed to vibrate through the walls. Just as quickly as the lights had appeared, they suddenly vanished, without a trace. The room was quiet again, but the unsettling silence only deepened their unease. The next morning, the family attempted to resume their normal routines. However, they quickly realized that something was terribly wrong. Their car, which had been parked in the driveway the night before, was now several miles away, parked on a dirt road outside of town. No one could recall having driven it there, and there were no signs of forced entry or anything unusual about the car itself. The Gallegos family also noticed that they were missing several hours from the night before, hours that they could not explain. They had no recollection of the time between the moment the lights had disappeared and when they woke up the following morning. It was as if time itself had simply vanished. The family's confusion turned to fear as they began to piece together their fragmented memories. The children began to recall strange, vivid images in their minds, images of beings with large, dark eyes and elongated bodies, moving around them in the night. Though they couldn't describe the beings in detail, their memories were filled with a sense of dread and paralysis. The parents, too, began to experience a deep sense of unease, but their memories were hazy, clouded by the passage of time. They could recall feeling frozen in place, as if they had no control over their own bodies. As the days passed, the Gallegos family sought answers. They turned to the local authorities, who, at first, dismissed the incident as a simple case of mistaken identity or a trick of the mind. But the family was adamant. They knew what they had experienced, and they weren't the only ones who had seen it. A few days after their experience, neighbors began to report similar sightings of the strange lights in the sky. The reports, however, were inconsistent. Some witnesses claimed they had seen the lights only briefly, while others spoke of seeing the lights for hours on end. The discrepancy in the accounts only deepened the mystery surrounding the incident. Local media coverage was scant, with reporters offering only brief mentions of the strange occurrences, attributing them to weather phenomena or the possibility of military aircraft testing. Yet, the lack of coverage and the dismissive attitude of the authorities didn't sit right with the Gallegos family. They knew they were not the only ones who had witnessed these strange events, and they were desperate to understand what had happened to them. As they continued to press for answers, their investigation took them into some unsettling territory. A few weeks later, the family was contacted by a researcher from a well-known UFO organization who had been investigating similar sightings in the area. The researcher, who had experience in tracking abduction cases, immediately recognized the patterns that the Gallegos family described. According to the researcher, the experience they had encountered was remarkably similar to other abduction reports he had been investigating in New Mexico, a state that had long been known as a hotspot for UFO activity. As the researcher delved deeper into the case, more disturbing details began to emerge. The Gallegos family had unknowingly been living in close proximity to an area that had long been associated with strange phenomena. Nearby, military installations had been conducting classified experiments for years, some of which were suspected to involve advanced technology that might explain the lights and the strange events the family had experienced. The researcher speculated that the lights might not have been extraterrestrial in origin, but rather the result of secret military testing. He suggested that the military may have been experimenting with experimental aircraft or energy weapons that were capable of producing the strange lights the family had seen. However, no official documentation could confirm this theory, leaving the question of what the family had truly encountered open to debate. Theories began to proliferate. Some suggested that the Gallegos family had been abducted by extraterrestrials, while others believed that they had been subjected to some sort of mind control or psychological experiment. Some of the more extreme theories claimed that the family had been part of a government cover-up, with their abduction being an intentional part of a larger operation. These theories, while speculative, began to gain traction in UFO communities, where the family's case became an example of a larger, more troubling pattern. But despite the mounting theories, the Gallegos family never found definitive answers. The case was left unresolved, and as time passed, the once vibrant discussions surrounding their experience began to fade into the background. While some people believed their account, others dismissed it as a mere fantasy or an elaborate hoax. And so, the Gallegos family story, much like countless others, became part of the broader tapestry of UFO lore, a story that remained on the fringe of public consciousness. What makes the Gallegos family's experience so chilling, however, is the lack of closure. The questions remain unanswered. What were the lights? Were they a natural phenomenon, a military experiment, or something else entirely? Did the Gallegos family truly encounter extraterrestrials, or was their experience the result of psychological manipulation? And perhaps most unsettling of all, what happened during those missing hours that they could never remember? For the Gallegos family, the experience would haunt them for the rest of their lives. But for the rest of us, it serves as a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying mysteries are the ones that never get solved. The lights in the sky may have faded, but the questions they left behind continue to linger, just beyond our reach, in the silent, star-filled night. Linda Napolitano's story is one that stands out in the annals of alien abduction cases, not just because of the strange events she endured, but because of the extraordinary circumstances surrounding her experience. It was the kind of case that blurred the line between ordinary life and something far more extraordinary, something otherworldly. The events unfolded on a quiet evening in 1989 in the heart of New York City, a place that, to the casual observer, would seem to be the last location where such an unsettling experience could occur. But as Linda would soon discover, the strange and inexplicable often find a way of intruding into the most mundane corners of our lives. Linda had always been a fairly grounded person, a hard-working woman in her 30s, living in an apartment in the bustling neighborhood of Brooklyn. She was no stranger to the occasional oddity or mystery, but she had never imagined that one evening she would find herself in the midst of an event that would change her life forever. It all began, as these things often do, with something small, a flash in the sky. At first, it seemed unremarkable, the kind of thing that anyone might dismiss as a passing light, a plane, or a star maybe. But this was no ordinary light. It was too bright, too focused, and it hovered unnervingly close to her window. Linda's first thought was that it might be a helicopter or some kind of aircraft, but as she peered out of her window, she realized that what she was seeing defied any rational explanation. The light wasn't just moving in odd patterns. It seemed to pulse, as though it were alive, conscious. It wasn't until she stepped closer to the window that she noticed the figures moving inside the light, figures that didn't look quite human. Tall, slender beings with features that could not easily be described. No eyes, just dark, hollow spaces where eyes should have been. Their forms were translucent, almost ethereal, as if they existed in a realm just slightly apart from our own. Linda's heart raced as she watched, frozen in place, unable to look away. The figures seemed to be moving toward her, their presence more oppressive the closer they got. It was then that something extraordinary happened. Linda was suddenly overcome with a sense of paralysis. She tried to scream, but no sound emerged from her mouth. Her limbs felt heavy, like they were encased in lead, and her vision blurred as the world around her began to distort. In an instant, she felt herself being pulled away from the window, drawn toward something she could not see. It was as if invisible hands were lifting her from the ground, and she was powerless to resist. Before she could fully comprehend what was happening, she found herself outside the confines of her apartment, hovering in midair, her feet no longer touching the ground. Linda would later describe this moment as both terrifying and surreal. She was being pulled toward a craft, one that was now clearly visible above her. It was like nothing she had ever seen before, a sleek, metallic object that seemed to shimmer with an inner light. The shape was vaguely saucer-like, but its surface was smooth, reflective, almost liquid in appearance. As she floated upward, Linda struggled to break free from the paralysis, but it was as though her body was not her own. She had no control, no agency, and in that moment, a profound sense of helplessness took over her mind. The next thing Linda remembered was being inside the craft. She could no longer feel the weight of gravity, and everything around her appeared to be bathed in a soft, cold light. The air was thick and metallic, almost like a sterile environment, and the beings who had been with her outside were now standing in the shadows. Their presence was unsettling, but it was their eyes, or the lack thereof, that she could not forget. They didn't speak in the conventional sense, but somehow she knew what they wanted, what they were doing. It was as if they were communicating with her telepathically, their thoughts invading her mind in a way that was both frightening and incomprehensible. Linda was subjected to a series of bizarre and traumatic medical examinations. These examinations, however, were not like anything she had ever heard of before. No physical instruments were used, at least not in any way she could recognize. Instead, she felt as if they were probing her very essence, her thoughts, her memories, her emotions. The beings did not appear to be interested in her body in the traditional sense, but in something far more intimate, something that transcended the physical world. Linda could sense that whatever they were doing, it was far beyond human understanding. In what felt like both an eternity and no time at all, Linda was suddenly aware of a shift. The beings began to fade, their presence growing distant. And just as quickly as the event had begun, she was back in her apartment, sitting by the window once again. The lights in the sky had vanished, and everything was still. But Linda knew that something had changed. She had been part of something that could not be explained, and yet it had felt so real, so undeniable. The strange thing, however, was that Linda could not remember the full extent of what had happened to her. When she tried to recall the event in its entirety, her mind became clouded, as though parts of the memory were locked away, hidden behind a veil she could not lift. It was only when she reached out to a close friend, someone she trusted, that the truth began to unravel. Her friend, who had been visiting the night of the event, confirmed that she had seen Linda standing by the window, staring out into the night sky, her face pale and expressionless. The friend recalled hearing Linda speak of the light and the figures, but she did not witness the strange, otherworldly events that Linda had experienced. A deep sense of confusion took root in Linda's mind. Was she losing her grip on reality? Had she imagined the entire experience? Or had something truly extraordinary happened to her? It wasn't until a few weeks later that Linda would come into contact with someone who would change the course of her investigation. A researcher, someone familiar with alien abduction cases, reached out to her after hearing of her experience through a mutual acquaintance. This researcher, who had been investigating similar cases for years, immediately recognized the similarities between Linda's story and a growing number of abduction accounts from around the world. The researcher's involvement would lead to the discovery of an unsettling pattern, a series of unexplained abductions in New York City and surrounding areas, each one with similar elements: strange lights, unexplainable paralysis, missing time, and the same eerie sense of communication with beings from another world. The researcher explained to Linda that what she had experienced was not unique, but was part of a larger phenomenon that had been ongoing for decades. In fact, Linda was not the only one to report seeing the same types of beings, nor was she the only one to experience the disorienting sensation of being taken aboard a craft. As Linda delved deeper into the investigation, she learned that her experience was not the isolated incident she had once believed it to be. Numerous others had encountered beings with similar characteristics: tall, thin, with large, black eyes that seemed to pierce through the very fabric of reality. The more she learned, the more unsettling the whole situation became. There were reports of other individuals who had been taken from their homes, their cars, or even while walking down the street, only to later find themselves returned, with no memory of what had transpired during the missing time. Despite the mounting evidence, Linda faced a great deal of skepticism from the wider public. The media, which initially found her story intriguing, quickly turned dismissive. Some speculated that she had suffered from some form of psychological breakdown, while others suggested that her experience was the result of a vivid dream or sleep paralysis. But Linda was certain what she had experienced was real. The beings she had encountered, the strange craft, and the overwhelming sense of fear that had accompanied the event were all etched into her mind, vivid and undeniable. The experience left Linda with more questions than answers. What did these beings want from her? Why had they taken her in the first place? And why, despite all the evidence of strange activity in the area, had no one else seemed to take these events seriously? Linda's life would never be the same again. She had glimpsed something that the world was not ready to understand, and now she was left to navigate the isolation and uncertainty that came with that knowledge. Her story, like so many others, remains one of the most compelling and chilling alien abduction accounts. It is a reminder that no matter how grounded we may feel in our lives, there are mysteries lurking just beyond our understanding, waiting to pull us into the unknown. And perhaps, as Linda's experience shows, sometimes we are not as alone as we think we are. It was a typical evening in the small town of Harlan, Kentucky. The air was cool, the sky clear, and the streets were quiet, as they often were in this rural corner of the world. Yet, for the Harlan family, this evening would mark the beginning of an experience that would forever change their lives. It all started with a camping trip, a simple family outing, a way to enjoy the great outdoors, far from the noise and distractions of everyday life. But in the blink of an eye, what should have been a peaceful night under the stars became the setting for something far more unnerving, something that none of them could explain. The Harlan family consisted of the father, James, the mother, Elizabeth, and their two children, Sarah and Benjamin. James had long been fascinated by the stars, and he often took his family on camping trips to escape the hustle and bustle of city life. On that fateful night, they found a quiet spot deep in the woods, surrounded by towering trees and a vast open sky. As they set up camp, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The children played in the dirt, Elizabeth set up the tent, and James prepared the fire. It was a kind of evening that people from small towns in Kentucky dreamed of, a moment of peace, simplicity, and connection with nature. But as the night wore on, things began to take an unexpected turn. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly. At first, James thought it was a trick of the eye, a flash of light in the distance, faint but present. He brushed it off, attributing it to a passing aircraft or a distant lightning strike. But then it happened again. The lights appeared, this time brighter, more distinct, and moving erratically across the sky. It wasn't a plane or a meteor. It was something else entirely. James called out to Elizabeth, but she too had seen the strange lights. She stood next to him, her face growing pale as the lights hovered above the trees, casting an eerie glow on the forest floor. The lights didn't behave like anything they had ever seen before. They didn't follow a straight path, but instead moved in unpredictable patterns, darting back and forth across the sky. They seemed to be watching them, following their every move. The family, now visibly shaken, huddled together around the campfire, trying to make sense of what they were witnessing. But no matter how hard they tried to rationalize it, there was no explanation that fit. It wasn't long before the lights began to grow closer. The family's anxiety mounted with every passing moment as the lights moved lower, closer to the treetops. The air felt thick, as if something unseen was pressing down on them. James tried to start the truck, intending to leave, but the engine refused to turn over. It was as though the very presence of the lights was interfering with the mechanics of their vehicle. Elizabeth, too, tried to call for help, but her phone, like the truck, was dead, the signal inexplicably lost. As the lights hovered just above the trees, the family felt a sudden wave of paralysis wash over them. It was an overwhelming sensation, as if their bodies were no longer under their control. They could see the lights, but they couldn't move, couldn't speak. They were trapped, unable to escape whatever was happening. In that moment, time seemed to stretch, as though they were suspended in a strange and terrifying limbo. The world around them became quiet, almost too quiet, as the night air seemed to stand still. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the lights vanished. The family was left in stunned silence, the air now empty and still. The world around them seemed unchanged, yet nothing felt the same. The disorienting silence was broken only by the sound of their own breathing, rapid and shallow. They sat there in the dark, trying to process what had just occurred. But the events that had unfolded in the last few minutes were beyond their comprehension. There was no explanation, no rational way to understand what they had just witnessed. They had been paralyzed, helpless, and terrified, and yet, when the lights disappeared, they were left with nothing but questions. As the family tried to regain some sense of normalcy, they realized that something had changed. The feeling of paralysis didn't fade immediately. James and Elizabeth noticed a strange sensation in their bodies, as though something had altered within them. But the worst was yet to come. The family soon realized that they were missing time, hours of the night that they could not account for. They had no memory of the events that took place after the lights disappeared. Their memories were fragmented, blurry, as though entire pieces of the night had been erased. In the days that followed, the family's confusion only deepened. James tried to speak with local authorities, but no one seemed interested in investigating the strange lights they had seen. The sheriff, a practical man, simply told them that they must have seen a meteor shower or perhaps an experimental aircraft. But the family knew better. They had witnessed something far more disturbing, something that didn't fit the usual explanations. They had been changed by the experience, and the fear they felt was not easily shaken. In the weeks that followed, other members of the Harlan community began to come forward with their own stories. Some had seen the lights in the sky the same night the Harlans had, while others had witnessed similar phenomena on different nights. There were reports of strange lights hovering over the forest, moving erratically, and sometimes even making bizarre, unearthly sounds. It became clear that the Harlan family was not alone in their experience. The lights were not a one-time occurrence, but part of a broader pattern, one that had been happening in the area for years. As the Harlans continued to search for answers, they stumbled upon a disturbing possibility. The area around their campsite was located near a series of military installations, old, decommissioned bases that had been the site of covert operations during the Cold War. Some researchers suggested that the strange lights the family had witnessed could have been connected to government experimentation, perhaps involving experimental aircraft or even secret weaponry. These theories were compelling, but they didn't fully account for the otherworldly nature of the encounter. The Harlan family had experienced something beyond the scope of earthly technology, something that seemed to defy all explanation. Despite the mounting evidence, the local authorities remained uninterested, and the media showed no inclination to investigate. The family story was dismissed as an exaggeration, an overactive imagination, or simply a misunderstanding of natural phenomena. Yet, the Harlan family knew what they had seen, and they were left with the uncomfortable realization that their experience was just one of many, part of a larger pattern that seemed to be unfolding in the shadows. As time passed, the fear began to give way to a sense of resolve. The family continued to search for answers, but they were met with dead ends at every turn. They were never able to uncover the truth behind the lights, the paralysis, or the missing time. But one thing became clear. They had been part of something far greater than themselves. The mystery of the Harlan abductions remained unsolved, a haunting reminder that there are things in this world that we may never fully understand, and sometimes the answers we seek are just beyond our grasp. And in the quiet of the Kentucky woods, the lights continued to flicker, as if waiting for the next family to stumble upon their strange, unexplainable presence. It was a crisp autumn night in 1992 when Adam and Rachel Simmons found themselves driving along the winding back roads of Montana, heading home after a weekend getaway. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving only a sliver of moonlight to illuminate the vast, empty stretch of highway that cut through the remote wilderness. The world around them seemed untouched, serene, almost otherworldly in its stillness. Adam, a seasoned truck driver, was used to long hours on the road, but even he couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled in his chest as they made their way back to the city. There was something off about the night, something he couldn't quite place. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was the oppressive silence that seemed to stretch out for miles. Whatever it was, it would soon become a night neither of them would ever forget. As they drove deeper into the forest, Adam noticed a peculiar light-off in the distance, hovering just above the treetops. It was faint at first, easy to mistake for a star or an airplane. But as the miles passed, the light grew brighter, moving in ways that defied any natural explanation. It didn't resemble the steady glow of an aircraft, nor did it flicker like a star. Instead, it pulsed, slowly, rhythmically, like a distant heartbeat. Adam, ever the skeptic, dismissed it as a trick of the eyes or perhaps a distant light from a nearby farm or town. But as the minutes ticked by, the light didn't fade. It only grew closer, brighter, and more erratic. Rachel, who had been silently staring out the window, was the first to break the silence. "Adam, do you see that?" she asked, her voice tinged with unease. Adam glanced over at her, his brow furrowing as he followed her gaze. The light was now unmistakable, and it was no longer in the distance. It was directly ahead of them, hanging motionless in the sky, just above the tree line. It was large, almost unnaturally so, and it emitted a soft, eerie glow that seemed to cast an unnatural light on the landscape below. The more Adam stared, the more he felt an inexplicable sense of dread creeping into his mind. It wasn't just the light that was unsettling, it was the feeling that accompanied it, a sensation that something was terribly wrong. Rachel's voice broke through his thoughts again. "I don't like this, Adam. It's not a plane. It's not a helicopter. It's something else." For the first time in years, Adam's confidence began to waver. His instincts told him to pull over, to turn around, to get away from whatever that light was. But something kept him going, a pull he couldn't explain. As the light grew closer, it seemed to take on a form, a shape, something that wasn't quite tangible. It was as though it was a part of the very air itself, its edges blurry, constantly shifting. Adam's grip tightened on the wheel, and Rachel's breathing grew shallow, her eyes wide with fear. Then, without warning, the light shot toward them, moving at an incredible speed. It was upon them in an instant, casting an almost blinding radiance that illuminated the entire truck. Adam slammed on the brakes, his heart racing as the world around him seemed to warp and distort. In the next moment, the truck was no longer on the road. It was floating, suspended in midair, as though gravity itself had been suspended. Rachel let out a scream as the truck seemed to tilt, spinning uncontrollably. Her body pressed into her seat, and her hands gripped the armrest so tightly her knuckles turned white. Adam tried to maintain control of the vehicle, but the steering wheel was unresponsive. He was powerless. It felt as though the very fabric of reality had unraveled around them. The truck, their only tether to the earthly world, was no longer grounded in anything familiar. It was as though they had been transported into another dimension, a place where the rules of physics didn't apply. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, everything stopped. The truck was once again on solid ground, its tires scraping along the rough road. The light was gone, vanished into the night, leaving nothing but the eerie silence in its wake. Adam and Rachel sat there in stunned silence, both too afraid to speak, too afraid to even move. The world around them had returned to normal, but they both knew that something had happened, something that defied all explanation. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the heavy breathing of both. Adam's hands shook on the steering wheel as he slowly pulled the truck to the side of the road. He needed to stop. He needed to figure out what had just happened. Rachel, too, was struggling to make sense of the experience. The suddenness, the intensity. It was as though time itself had been suspended, leaving them with nothing but a deep, pervasive fear that they couldn't shake. It was as if they had been taken, even if just for a moment, and returned to a place where the normal rules of reality no longer applied. Rachel was the first to speak, her voice trembling. What the hell just happened? What was that thing? Adam shook his head, his mind racing. I don't know. I don't know what it was. But I swear, it wasn't like anything I've ever seen before. They sat in the dark for a while, processing what had happened. Neither of them could offer any concrete explanation. Adam, ever the skeptic, tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some sort of military experiment, he thought. Maybe they had stumbled upon a secret test site, some kind of high-tech craft. But the more he thought about it, the less that explanation made sense. The light had moved in ways that no human-made craft could, darting through the sky with impossible speed and precision. There was no way it was anything they had ever seen before. As they sat there, trying to make sense of the experience, something strange happened. The radio, which had been silent up until that point, crackled to life. At first, it was just static, but then a voice came through, distant, distorted, but unmistakably human. "You're not alone," the voice said, before the static returned, cutting off the transmission. Adam and Rachel exchanged nervous glances. They hadn't touched the radio. There was no way anyone else could have been on that frequency, especially not out here, in the middle of nowhere. And yet there it was, a message, a cryptic warning, that seemed to confirm their worst fears. What they had experienced wasn't just a coincidence. It wasn't just a trick of the light. Something was out there. And whatever it was watching them. The rest of the drive home was a blur. Neither of them could focus on the road, their minds consumed with the encounter. The unease never left them, lingering in the air like a heavy fog. Adam's thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion, disbelief, and fear. He kept replaying the events in his mind, trying to find something, anything, that could explain what had happened. But there was nothing. No logical explanation. No reason that made sense. The days that followed were no better. Both Adam and Rachel experienced strange symptoms, headaches, dizziness, and a profound sense of unease that hung over them like a cloud. Rachel began having vivid, unsettling dreams of strange figures, beings with elongated limbs and eyes that seemed to pierce into her very soul. Adam, too, began to question his sanity. Had they truly seen what they thought they saw? Or had the isolation, the long drive, and the fatigue played tricks on their minds? But no matter how hard they tried to dismiss it, neither of them could forget the encounter. The memory of the light, the strange sensations, the voice on the radio. These things lingered, refusing to fade. It was as though the experience had marked them, as if they were now part of something far greater than themselves, something they didn't understand. And so, the Simmons family was left with a question that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. What was out there in the night sky? And why had it chosen them? The truth, they knew, would remain elusive, but the mystery of that night, of the unexplainable light, the strange radio transmission, and the feeling of being watched, would remain with them forever, a shadow that never quite lifted. The sky was still, the kind of quiet that wraps around you like a blanket, offering both peace and a strange kind of vulnerability. For Joseph and Emily Peters, a weekend retreat to the rugged hills of North Carolina should have been the perfect escape from their busy lives. The mountain cabin was secluded, a rustic haven tucked deep in the woods, far from the noise and stress of the city. The couple had planned the trip months in advance, eager to disconnect from the world and reconnect with each other. They spent the afternoon hiking along the trails, taking in the breathtaking views, and enjoying the tranquility of the forest. Little did they know, their peaceful getaway would soon be overshadowed by an experience that would challenge everything they thought they knew about reality. It was on the second night of their stay, just after dinner, when they noticed the first sign that something was amiss. Emily had stepped outside to enjoy the cool evening air, while Joseph cleaned up inside. The sky was clear, the stars scattered across the heavens like diamonds, casting a soft glow over the dense trees surrounding the cabin. Emily, a lover of a night sky, had always found solace in stargazing, but that night, as she gazed upward, something caught her eye, a strange, bright light hovering in the distance, just above the tree-line. At first, she thought it might be a plane, but the light wasn't moving in a way that made sense. It was too steady, too still, and the longer she watched it, the more uneasy she began to feel. The light seemed to pulse softly, as if it were alive, breathing in the darkness. It wasn't until Joseph joined her outside and saw the same thing that their unease turned into genuine concern. They stood together in silence, watching as the light slowly began to grow brighter and closer. It was too large to be an ordinary star or aircraft, and it seemed to be hovering at an impossible height just above the tree line. Neither of them spoke for several minutes, both of them waiting for the other to offer an explanation, but neither could. The more they looked, the more the light seemed to defy explanation. There was no sound, no sign of anything conventional, a plane, a helicopter, or even a distant farm light. It was as if the light existed in its own realm, one that was not bound by the laws of physics they understood. As the minutes ticked by, the light drew nearer still, until it was directly above them. It was no longer the size of a distant star, but a massive, bright object, far too large and too close for comfort. Joseph's heart began to race. Something about it felt wrong, and he instinctively grabbed Emily's hand. She was trembling, her wide eyes fixed on the light, which now hung above them, motionless, almost as if it were studying them. Emily had an unsettling sense of déjà vu, as though she had seen something like this before in a dream, in some far-off memory she couldn't quite place. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden realization that the light was not just above them. It was descending. It came down slowly, almost deliberately, until it was hovering just above the clearing in front of the cabin. Joseph took a step back, his instinct telling him to flee, to run back into the cabin, but Emily, though frightened, was frozen in place. She watched, almost hypnotically, as the light began to shift and change. It no longer appeared to be just one object, but several smaller lights, pulsating in unison. The air around them grew heavier, colder, and a strange hum seemed to emanate from the light, vibrating the very air they breathed. It was a low, almost imperceptible sound, but it resonated deep within them, setting their nerves on edge. Then, without warning, everything went silent. The hum disappeared, and the world around them seemed to freeze. It was as if time itself had stopped. The lights above them blinked out one by one, leaving only darkness. Joseph could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he couldn't move. The moment stretched on, endless and surreal, until the lights blinked back on, brighter than before. It wasn't just the lights that had changed. The air around them seemed to shift, as if the very atmosphere had been altered. Joseph's thoughts grew clouded, and his limbs began to feel heavy, as though they were being pulled in different directions. It was at that moment that Emily felt the overwhelming sensation of being drawn toward the light. It wasn't just the visual allure of the lights. It was a force, an invisible pull that seemed to latch onto her very being. She opened her mouth to speak, to say something, anything, but no words came out. Her body was no longer her own. She felt as if she were being moved by an outside force, as if the very air around her had become solid, constricting her movements. It was like walking through thick fog, slow, sluggish, and disorienting. Joseph, terrified and desperate to save her, reached out to grab her arm, but as soon as his fingers made contact, a wave of dizziness washed over him. His vision blurred, and the world around him seemed to tilt. The ground beneath him felt as though it was shifting, bending out of shape, as if the laws of gravity no longer applied. Panic set in. He tried to shake himself free from whatever hold had taken them, but his body refused to obey. Everything around them seemed to flicker, the edges of reality warping and distorting. And then, just as abruptly as it had begun, the sensation vanished. They were back in the clearing, standing where they had been moments before. The lights above them were gone, replaced by the familiar starry sky. The air was once again still, and the cold chill had dissipated. Emily and Joseph were left standing there in stunned silence, each trying to process what had just occurred. Time, they realized, had passed differently in that moment, unaccounted for, lost between the strange sensation of paralysis and the blinding light that had enveloped them. They looked at each other, eyes wide, both searching for an explanation, but neither could find the words. It took several minutes before they gathered enough composure to speak. Emily was the first to break the silence. "What the hell was that? What happened to us?" Joseph shook his head, his voice hoarse. "I don't know. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't anything I've ever seen before. That wasn't just some lights in the sky. That was something else." They stumbled back to the cabin, but even the safety of the walls couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between them and the world around them. Something intangible, but deeply unsettling. The events of that night stayed with them, gnawing at their minds, pushing them to ask more questions than they had answers for. What had happened to them? What was the source of the lights? And why had they been drawn to them in such a way? And perhaps most disturbing of all, how had they lost time? How could they explain the sense of displacement, the feeling that they had been taken somewhere else, if only for a brief moment? The next few days were filled with a quiet sense of dread. Emily and Joseph could not shake the feeling that something had changed within them. They had experienced something extraordinary, something that defied all reason and explanation, but it was also something that had left them feeling profoundly isolated. They had been witnesses to an event that no one else had seen, and there was no one they could turn to for answers. No one in their lives would believe them, and even if they did, who could explain it? Their search for answers only seemed to lead them down a rabbit hole of uncertainty. They discovered, through casual conversation with a local shopkeeper, that several other people in the area had experienced similar phenomena: strange lights in the sky, feelings of being drawn toward them, and lost time. It seemed like a pattern, but no one could offer a clear explanation. Some believed it was military testing, others speculated about extraterrestrial involvement, but no one had definitive answers. For Emily and Joseph, the event had changed them in ways they couldn't explain. It had left a scar on their perception of the world, a constant reminder that there were forces at play in the universe that they would never fully understand. They returned home, but the unease lingered. The memories of that night, of the pulsing lights, the paralyzing sensation, and the inexplicable loss of time, haunted them, keeping them awake at night, staring up at the stars, wondering if they would ever truly know what had happened to them. The truth, it seemed, would remain elusive, buried in the silence of the night sky. And for Emily and Joseph Peters, that was perhaps the most unsettling revelation of all. They would never know for sure, and yet the mystery would remain with them forever, like a shadow that couldn't be shaken.